Hello, fellow Democrats, futurists, and problem solvers. This is After the Oligarchy, where we explore the details of humanity's bright future. Today, I'm speaking with Dr. Philipp Dapprich. Philipp Dapprich is a political economist and philosopher working at the Free University Berlin. His PhD was entitled Rationality and Distribution in the Socialist Economy, and he's also co-author of a forthcoming book entitled Economic Planning in an Age of Environmental Crisis. Today, we'll be discussing his work on refining the model of economic planning, first proposed by Cockshott and Cottrell in Towards a New Socialism. Today's conversation is in association with Meta, the Center for Post-Capitalist Civilization. If you're not familiar with Towards a New Socialism, you can buy the book or find a free PDF online. You can also find interviews with Paul Cockshott on this channel, and I'll put links in the description to Philipp Dapprich's doctoral thesis as well as a relevant paper. Philipp Dapprich, thank you very much for joining me again.
Thank you for having me again.
First thing I'm going to say is I really recommend that viewers watch the previous interview because they're not standalone interviews. We covered a lot of important stuff last time about opportunity costs, the motivations for your work. And really, if viewers want to understand what we're talking about now, they should watch that. So I'm just going to say that once. So today, there's two main things that we want to talk about. The first is we want to get into the details of the simulations that you ran to investigate your new techniques of opportunity cost valuations in the Towards a New Socialism model. And the other thing is we want to talk about a fundamental question, a fundamental problem in economic planning and central planning about choice of production technologies. Can you introduce the problem and how you approach it?
Right. So one approach to planning has long been to use so-called input-output tables. And input-output tables, they are commonly published even by sort of Western capitalist countries, and they show you which industries use inputs from which other industries and which output, how much output they produce with this. And the problem with that is that these tables are generally very aggregated. So you have entire industries, you might have something like forestry and agriculture all bunched together into one column of the table, and it doesn't differentiate between various different kinds of products within those industries. It won't differentiate between different kinds of agricultural products, produce, lumber, and so on. So that's the first problem. They're way too aggregated. And what you'd have to do is to have a much more disaggregated table, which differentiates between different kinds of products.
Can I just jump in for a sec? When you're talking about input-output tables for viewers, you're saying that they have these very aggregated tables, and they're saying, for example, in the agricultural sector, so the agricultural sector is outputting, let's say, corn and milk, and then you're looking at also the inputs required for that. So, for example, grain, iron, electricity. That's fundamentally what
Exactly. Yeah. So the input-output table will tell you not just how much is the forestry and agriculture sector producing, but also which inputs from which other industries is it using. So is it using a lot of input from the energy industry or from the mining industry? How much labor is it using? That's an important input as well. But as I said, it doesn't differentiate between different kinds of products being produced in those industries. It's all aggregated into one column. And if you want to plan sort of specifically, not just, what the size of a certain sector should be, but precisely which kinds of products should be produced, and that's the level of detail of planning that we really need, those input-output tables are not going to be very useful. So the first thing you have to do is get a much more disaggregated table, which differentiates within the same industry between different kinds of product. So, for example, you differentiate between wheat and potatoes and tomatoes and so on, rather than having them all bunched together as one sector. So that's the first problem, that they don't differentiate between different kinds of products. The second problem is they don't differentiate between different ways of producing that product. So the input-output table looks at, the past year or whatever year this table was made for, and looks, how much was used in this industry to produce whatever that industry produces. So even if we were to differentiate that and we look at potato farming, or we look at electricity generation, maybe that's a better example here, it will not differentiate between electricity that's produced by coal power plants versus nuclear power plants versus solar and wind power plants. But if you want to plan precisely which methods should be used, you need to be able to differentiate this. Instead, what an input-output table does, it just tells you, at the current mix of electricity production, this is how many tons of coal were used to produce electricity. This is sort of how many wind turbines were installed, and so on and so on. And this is how much labor was being used in the electricity industry. So you don't just want to differentiate between different kinds of products. Here we're talking about the same product, electricity, but there are different methods of producing it. And one of the fundamental questions, if you want to determine an efficient allocation of resources, is which of these methods should we be using? So we have to be able to tell them apart. And the way that I do that is, so I kind of move away from these traditional input-output tables and instead have tables which don't have an entire sector or even a single product as one column, but instead have a production technique. And producing electricity with coal power would be a different production technique from producing it with wind power or nuclear power and so on. And each column would then list, well, with this particular kind of production technique, how much labor is needed, how much coal would be needed, how many wind engines would be needed to produce a certain output of electricity. And this can then serve as a basis for determining a production plan which precisely specifies which techniques should be used to what extent to produce the optimal overall output.
So thank you for that overview. And let me ask, in a traditional input-output table, like you're saying, it's effectively a snapshot of the production techniques which are currently in use. However, if we wanted to devise a plan for the economy that was the most efficient, we would, of course, not only want to find the best distribution of resources given fixed production techniques, but we'd also want to pick what the best production technique for each good and service would be. So you're saying that part of how you approach this is that rather than using a traditional input-output table, you're now introducing or including separate production techniques into some kind of table or matrix. Like you said, you could have multiple entries for electricity 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. So could you talk more about how can a planning algorithm actually choose between these different techniques, choose between one method of electricity generation over another?
What I call a plan in the end is basically a specification of which production techniques should be used at which intensity. So intensity here means if you use it at an intensity of 1, then you'll have exactly sort of the input stated in the table and the output stated in the table. If you use it at an intensity of 2, that means you're using it twice as much, right? Which means you have twice as many inputs, twice as many outputs. So a plan in the end is supposed to specify which of these techniques should be used at what intensity. And the idea is that you calculate the plan which uses the mix of techniques which maximizes the overall production output. And that can be calculated using linear programming. So you can determine the optimal plan, i.e. the mix of production techniques which maximizes overall production.
So in order for this to function then, presumably, let's say in the real world, then there would have to be some kind of register or list of available production techniques. So how could we imagine that operating?
If you want to imagine sort of some kind of central planning agency being in charge of this planning process in some sense, or administrating it, they would need to have this table which lists all sort of the available production techniques, or at least the ones which sort of plausibly could be used in an optimal plan. They need to have all the entries, so they need to know which resources are being used and which output is being produced like that by that, right? The way that I imagine that this table would be created is, well, you could have various production units communicating sort of what production techniques they have available, or you could also have research centers which sort of continually come up with new methods and which would then perhaps in an experimental fashion determine the resource usage of those production techniques, how much can be produced with those resources using that technique, and then sort of communicate that to sort of a central computer system where this would then be entered into the table.
I'm thinking about computation here. And of course, probably the great attraction of using these Leontief style input-output tables is that they make computation of a comprehensive plan so much easier. Now, if you introduce multiple production techniques, multiple production vectors for each product, that's obviously going to make it more computationally complex. So What are your thoughts about this? Is it still feasible? And if so, how would you quantify that?
I think actually the biggest increase in computational complexity comes from differentiating between different kinds of products within the same industry, right? Because that will, so a typical input-output table will have maybe 100, at maximum maybe 500 different industries, but there might be hundreds of millions of different kinds of products. So that will massively increase the size of the table and thus the computational complexity of the problem that has to be solved. The different kinds of production techniques, well, if we maybe imagine that there might be like 2 or 3 on average different ways of producing a product, that will of course increase it further, but that's probably not the most relevant factor here, right? The differentiation between different kinds of products within the same industry will probably, at least that's my guess, be the bigger factor here. So the answer is yes, absolutely. That increases the computational complexity and increases the length of time that a computer would need to solve these kinds of problems.
Yes, certainly disaggregating the products has an enormous effect. And that's very relevant. I'm asking particularly about different production techniques because I think Cockshott and Cottrell have very convincingly argued that, let's say, without multiple production techniques, a comprehensive plan can be feasibly calculated for on the order of 100 million or a billion distinct products. And what you're saying is that if we have, say, a handful of leading candidates for production techniques, because it's not necessary to list every single production technique available, including all of the ones which are really inefficient. There's probably a handful of ones which are more or less equally successful. Maybe one is better in one aspect, another is better in another aspect. You're saying that, let's say, if these additional production techniques are on the order of 10 or less, then you're just looking at multiplying the calculations by a factor of 10.
Exactly. So I think potentially imaginable production techniques can be already sort of excluded from an engineering standpoint because we already know that, they use a lot of certain resources. We could in theory produce electricity by having hamsters on treadmills or something like that, right? But we know that's not going to be an economically viable and feasible way of producing electricity compared to nuclear power or wind power or something like that. So I think a lot can be excluded already. And I actually think that there's a way to sort of also formally calculate that without already sort of having to do the optimization, which is if you had, based on past plans, for example, you were able to calculate the opportunity costs of not just various products, but also of inputs for these products. We talked about opportunity cost in the last part. So if you were to calculate that opportunity cost, you could also use that as sort of a cost indicator to give you a vague idea of the costs of different inputs. And then if you notice, this production techniques, it uses a lot of this really valuable, scarce resource that has a very high opportunity cost that we really need somewhere else, right? Then you can maybe already preclude that from the list to begin with. And, sort of that's not going to be something that would be used in an optimal plan anyway.
So you're saying that the opportunity cost valuations could be used to screen for efficient production techniques.
Exactly. Yeah.
Okay. And actually on that point, so firstly, I'm just trying to picture the introduction of these multiple production techniques for each product. Is that essentially functioning like you're adding, so rather than say having electricity as an entry, it's almost like you have now multiple products. We know that they're electricity, but in mathematical terms, it's like there are.
Well, so you need a way to specify to the algorithm, to the computer, that these are the same product, right? Because this will be relevant when calculating sort of which techniques should be used and how much do we need of a certain product and so on. So the algorithm needs to know which product is being produced. The way I do this is by having actually 2 different kinds of tables. So the first table specifies only the inputs of various production techniques. And then the second table specifies to you which product is it that's being produced with this technique. And one advantage of this is also that you can actually have multiple products of the same production technique. So in some production processes, you might have sort of maybe the main product, but you also have some byproduct that is being used. So for example, something that has sort of been in the news lately because of high energy prices, fertilizer manufacturers sort of lowered their production but because a byproduct of the fertilizer production process is CO2, that is then used for fizzy drinks and other kinds of things. And that also sort of reduced the availability of CO2. So by having these two different tables, which one specifies the inputs, the other the outputs, you can then also have in the output table, you can have non-zero entries for multiple products. So you could have production techniques which produce more than one output.
Yes, that's a good point, because that is certainly relevant information for actually quite a lot of products. And if we want to have a more, let's say, circular economy, that's important information, where we don't want to just throw away byproducts. We want to use byproducts efficiently, as efficiently as possible. Staying on the topic of computational complexity just for a little bit longer, the opportunity cost valuations, what are the ramifications there on computation?
The way that I calculated them in my thesis was basically I did one optimization. We talked last time about this sort of free bread method, for example, which might be used to produce one free unit of bread. And then you see sort of how that increases the overall output. So you do one calculation without any of these methods. And then you do an extra calculation for each product, basically, to see how much you increase the optimized production output when you have one unit of it for free. And that, of course, means that you have to do sort of a lot of extra calculations. But there is actually a computationally much easier way of doing this with linear programming. So in linear programming, you actually get certain factors which are used in the optimization process, which seem to be equivalent to my way of calculating it. And you get these basically computationally for free. So there isn't any sort of significant increase in the computational complexity if you also want to calculate these opportunity costs.
So what you're saying is that you can actually introduce, say, change from labor time calculations to opportunity cost calculations, which on the face of it would seem to require a lot more computation. But actually, at the end of it, these two methods, labor cost and opportunity cost, actually end up with roughly the same order of computational complexity.
Yes. So at least that's the case if you use linear programming.
Mm-hmm.
The problem is that linear programming still seems to be a bit too complex for sort of the number of different products and production techniques that we have to consider. But there are sort of better ways of doing that. So Cockshott and Cottrell proposed this harmony algorithm. I think Paul Cockshott was actually the one that developed this, which is more computationally efficient than linear solving these kinds of planning problems. What I don't know is whether there's also a way using the harmony algorithm to get these opportunity cost factors. So I think that's something that sort of still needs to be looked into, is whether in the end you can also get these for free using an optimization method, which is sort of sufficiently computationally efficient to calculate a plan for sort of millions, hundreds of millions of different products and production techniques within sort of a time frame that's acceptable.
Okay, so what you're saying is that the opportunity cost valuations actually do add in significantly more computation. So this is a topic for future research.
Well, they don't add anything if you use linear programming. But the question is, well, is linear programming actually fast enough to solve these kinds of problems? And Paul Cockshott suggests that actually with linear programming, it would still require too much time to solve these kinds of problems, too much computer time to solve these kinds of problems. And you actually need a more efficient algorithm. And he proposes the harmony algorithm, which does solve it in time. So the question is whether what's true for linear programming is that you can basically get these valuations for free, whether that is also true for the harmony algorithm. And that's something that I simply don't know.
This is something to be worked out. It's an open question. All right. Would you be interested in talking about the opportunity cost of land in particular?
Yeah, I mean, it's not that different from other factors, really. But we could briefly talk about that. Yeah,
it's basically the same process.
Yeah. So the idea would be that you consider, well, if we had sort of 1 unit of land extra, right? How much does that increase production?
Okay, let's park that for now. Because that requires us to go back through all of the technique again. Okay, so last time we discussed in depth the method that you've introduced to calculate the opportunity cost of different resources, different goods and services in a democratic central plan. But also you did some simulations to investigate this, and we didn't really talk about that much. So would you like to talk about that now?
Yeah, sure. Do you want me to just briefly outline?
Yeah, please.
Okay. The basic idea of the simulation, or the sort of motivation behind it, is I wanted to see how the composition of products that is being produced will differ in the traditional labor value model and sort of my model using opportunity cost. And specifically, I was interested in seeing how emission rights, if you constrain the allowable emissions for the economy overall, you put a cap on emissions, how does that affect which kinds of products are being produced? And I thought the best way of testing that would be a computer simulation. So the computer simulation, on the one hand, exists precisely on sort of, or at least sort of a simplified version of the kinds of planning algorithms that you would apply in the real world, on the one hand. And then on the other hand, you need to also consider the behavior of consumers. And of course, in a computer simulation, you don't have real consumers. And in the real world, you would. So these would be real people going to the supermarket, deciding what to use their vouchers or tokens or money or whatever you want to call it on. But for the purpose of the computer simulation, I devised sort of a very simple agent-based model which simulates, so to say, the behavior of individual consumers. And then you can observe, well, with consumers behaving in this way, how would the planning algorithm react to that? How would it change the composition of products that are being produced?
Can we just take a brief detour here, which I think people might find interesting? So some people will know what agent-based modeling is, but others won't. And I just think it would be interesting if you just explained briefly what that is, because it's a different kind of modeling than has traditionally been done for decades and decades. And it's something that's become a lot more popular now, particularly in economics. So
yeah. So with agent-based modeling, you're basically modeling individual agents, right? So you're saying, okay, well, we have maybe 1,000 different agents, and we're going to sort of model for each one of them, how are they going to behave in a certain situation? How are they going to interact with each other, with the environment, and so on, right? Which choices, which decisions are they going to make? And of course, then you have some sort of things about how people will react to various circumstances. And there might also be an element of chance. So my model does include an element of chance as well, but with probabilities of various decisions depending on certain circumstances and also certain factors you can pre-specify as someone running this simulation.
Yeah, so so people can picture this who aren't familiar with it. You know, you could imagine, for example, if you're one of these evil security, inverted commas, corporations trying to prepare the oligarchy to deal with the various uprisings which are due to happen in the coming century. You can imagine a crowd control simulation where you have individual people, and you could imagine looking at them, and then there are simple rules which govern their behavior. Like, you know, if they're enclosed by a certain number of other agents, they might act like this, and so forth. And so you program in these very basic rules for what they're going to do, and then you just watch what happens when you throw all of these marbles together, basically, and they interact with each other, and sometimes very surprising things can happen. Okay, well, anyway, that's agent-based. Exactly. That's agent-based modeling. But so you're talking about using that to model consumers in the simulation. So please continue.
So in my simulation, the basic idea or what I wanted from the consumers is I wanted their decisions to be price dependent. So basically, what that means is that if the price of a good increases suddenly, they should be less likely to buy this kind of product and maybe choose some alternative instead, right? And it was the basic idea. And the way I did the model, because I wanted to keep it very simple, it is price dependent. So you get exactly sort of this result under sort of very specific circumstances. But as long as these are met, then you get significant price reaction of consumers so that they're less likely to buy a product if the price of that product increases. But some still will buy it, right? So some people will still buy a product even if it's ridiculously expensive. And the real world equivalent would be someone who values this product so much that they're willing to pay even a very high price for it. And you get some people like that. And you get that in the simulation as well. The way that I've done this is basically each consumer has a sort of infinite shopping list, and this shopping list is ordered. So the consumer, and it's sort of procedurally generated, you generate sort of as much as you need basically until the consumer stops shopping. And you start off with the first item on the list, and that's sort of, the top priority for that consumer. And if the consumer can afford that item, then she or he will purchase that item, and then moves on to the second item. And this then continues until basically the consumer isn't able to afford an item. I think 3 times in a row is what I picked here as sort of the stop condition, right? So if there are 3 items on the list in a row that the consumer can no longer afford because she or he has already spent all of her credits on sort of the items further up on the list, then she'll conclude that, well, she's basically run out of money. She can't afford anything else. She's going to go home now. The reason that this yields, under certain circumstances, yields sort of a price dependent behavior, consumption behavior, is that if the price of a product is more expensive, it is more likely that she'll not have enough credits left to be able to purchase that, and we'll have to skip the item and see if there's something else further down on the list that you can still afford. So that's how you get sort of this price-dependent reaction, with people being less likely to purchase items as their price increases.
Hello, this is After the Oligarchy. A quick message. If you're enjoying this, please press the like button. It makes a difference. Don't forget to visit aftertheoligarchy.com to see full transcripts of videos plus other material. And on Twitter, I'm at After Oligarchy if you're into that sort of thing. As we head back to the show now, let's keep our heads cool and our critical thinking sharp. Now back. Okay, so the aim there is you're trying to create a model of consumer behavior where consumers are responsive to prices. Because the point of this, the essential point of this in the simulation of the model is, the essential point of this is to model consumer feedback so that they're responsive to prices. And then you're saying that also this is done in a statistical way where, so essentially there's a statistical distribution of preferences is what it amounts to. Even if something is very expensive, like, there's a very expensive guitar, well, somebody will want to buy that. Most people won't.
Exactly. Yeah. So some people will still purchase it. And what you also get with this agent-based model, which you wouldn't get with, or which would be more difficult to get with sort of standard neoclassical models, is that the choice of products doesn't just depend on the price of an individual product. So how much will be bought of, say, potatoes, how many potatoes will be bought, doesn't just depend on the price of potatoes, but it also depends on the price of other products. Because if potatoes, maybe they have a fair price, right? But something else is a real bargain, then people still might sort of choose to use their limited funds not to buy potatoes and buy something else instead. So that is actually something else that I wanted to capture in this model, and which I've accomplished, is that the amount of a product being bought doesn't just depend on its own price, but also on the price of everything else that could be bought instead. So these are sort of the 2 important factors that I cared about and which sort of are realized in the model. But of course, overall, it's not sort of a particularly realistic model of how people behave. It's not supposed to be. If you were to apply this model in the real world, you wouldn't need this consumer model in the first place. You'd have real people doing this, right? So realism is not necessarily what I was interested in. These 2 sort of factors is what I cared about: price-dependent behavior of consumers, and that it doesn't just depend, the amount of a product being bought doesn't just depend on its own price, but also on the price of alternative products. Okay, so you've got that consumer model, but of course, your overarching goal isn't to model consumer behavior. That is in the service of a larger goal, which is an optimal plan. So let's talk about the other aspects of the simulation. Yes. So the way these 2 parts then fit together, you have on the one hand sort of this optimal planning algorithm, the consumer feedback mechanism, which we talked about last time. And the consumer behavior is then, of course, well, the consumer model tells you what is the consumer feedback going to be. And so at a given supply, so this is sort of, the optimal plan tells you sort of how much is being produced of various products. That tells you how much is available for consumers. That's the supply. That can then be compared to the demand at a certain price level. So you market the consumer products at certain prices to consumers, and you see, well, what is going to be the demand for various products based on the consumer model. So then you have supply and demand, and you can compare these, and you might observe, well, actually at the current prices, the demand for a product is really high, higher than the supply. And then based on sort of one of these two feedback mechanisms, which we talked about last time, you'd adjust the price to try to balance supply and demand. So you would, in this case, increase the price. And because the consumer model is reactive to these prices, that means demand will go down. If the opposite is the case, so actually at current prices, the demand for a product is much lower than what's been made available through production, than the supply, then you actually lower the price to encourage sort of more consumers to pick these kinds of products so that they don't go to waste. So that's the first step, this comparison of supply and demand. And this is really where the consumer model interacts with the planning algorithm and the feedback methods that we talked about last time. And this is then done 30 times. So you can imagine that that this is sort of 1 month consisting of 30 days. And every day we sort of adjust the prices somewhat to try to create this match of supply and demand. And what I found in sort of the very simple simulations that I run is that usually after around 20 days, you'd have a pretty good match of supply and demand. I took a few extra days. I took 30 because I also thought, that fits well with sort of 1 month. So we can maybe better imagine that. And so after this 30-day period, usually you'll have the market clearing prices, which match supply and demand. Now you know what the market clearing prices for a product are. You can also calculate the opportunity cost in the way that we discussed in the last interview. And now you have to make them comparable. So the way that you do it is you now have the market clearing prices after this 30-day period. And you can also calculate the opportunity costs in the way that we discussed last time for various products. You now have to make these two comparable because they might be on a sort of a completely different scale. So you want to what's called normalize them, bring them sort of on the same level. And the way that I do that is sort of I modify the opportunity costs such that the relative costs of various products remain the same. So if one item costs twice as much originally as another item, those relations will be maintained, right? But the overall cost of all the different products that have been produced will be the same now after normalization as the overall price at the market clearing prices of all the products that are available. And this way you maintain the proportions of different costs while having them sort of on the same scale as market clearing prices, so that market clearing prices and opportunity costs of products can now be compared.
Sorry, just to make that concrete. So
go ahead.
For viewers, so, if you've calculated that the opportunity cost of bread is, I'm just going to pick random numbers, is €1,000 or 1,000, let's say, and you have potatoes, the opportunity cost is €500. But if you look in the shop, then price of bread is €1 and the price of potatoes is 50 cents. So first of all, you're saying that the proportions are the same. The relative prices in a way are the same, but you can't compare an opportunity cost of bread, which is €1,000 with the price of bread, which is €1. That'll end up with nonsense.
Well, so, I mean, the proportions won't necessarily be the same with opportunity costs and prices, right? So it might be that the cost of produce. So at this point, at least, right, it can still be the case that the cost of, what were the examples that you gave? Bread and
potatoes, yeah.
Bread and potatoes, right? So the cost of, 1 unit of bread might be of producing it. The opportunity cost of producing it might be twice as much as 1 unit of potatoes, but the price of it is actually maybe 3 times. So that can still be the case. But what you want to avoid is that they are on completely different scales, because, I mean, you assumed opportunity cost is already sort of measured in euros or something like that, right? Right now, it's not being measured in the same unit as the credits or the vouchers or the money that you're using to purchase items at all. They're not measured in the same unit. So you have to make them comparable in some sense. And as I said, so the way sort of doing it is not to change the proportions of the cost. So that would stay 2-to-1, even if the price is 3-to-1, right? So you maintain these proportions, but the overall value of all the products has to perhaps be reduced. So let's say, on average, the cost of producing an individual product is 1,000, but the price of it on average is 1, then you have to reduce the cost by a factor of 1,000, reduce that for all products, right? To have them comparable. That's the basic idea.
Okay, and one of the things there is that while prices would be in something we could imagine it would be might be in something like euro, but the opportunity cost valuations, what that number is it's measuring. It's in terms of fulfillment of the plan. It's a fulfillment of the target vector. So it's not. It doesn't have the same unit as a price.
Yeah. So the unit is sort of, whatever the unit of the objective function is, which could be sort of tons of grain, for example. Right, because you see sort of a slight increase in the value of the optimized objective function, and that's what you're measuring here as the opportunity cost. But you then want to make that comparable to prices, and so you might have to scale the opportunity costs down a bit or scale them up, right, while maintaining the proportions. So you might increase them by a factor of 1,000 or decrease them by a factor of 1,000, something like that, such that in the end the overall cost of all items available is the same as the overall price of all items available.
Okay, so what's the next step?
Okay, so the next step is after this 30-day period, you have the market clearing prices for items. You can also calculate the opportunity cost for the items. You scale the opportunity cost to be comparable to the prices, and then you compare them. So for each product, you would look at, okay, well, the price for that item is maybe 10, but the cost of producing it is only 9. And then because the price is higher than the cost, it means, there's a lot of sort of demand even at a high price for this product, which means we should be producing more of this. People are willing to pay the cost of producing this item. And they're actually even people who are willing to pay more than that. So we'll produce more of it in the future. And so you adjust the plan target entry for that product. So the plan target, to sort of repeat from last time, specifies the proportions at which various products are being produced. For bread now, if our example is bread and you have a price for bread that's higher than the opportunity cost, then you increase the entry for bread such that in the next plan period, we'll sort of have a higher proportion of bread being produced in sort of the output mix that's being produced. If the opposite is the case, so let's say for potatoes, the market clearing price is actually lower than the opportunity cost of producing potatoes, then you'll decrease the entry for potatoes in the plan target vector, which specifies sort of the proportions at which things are being produced. And what you then get is basically, well, in the next plan period, 30 days, the next month, you'd be producing relatively more grain compared to potatoes because you've now increased the proportion for grain and decreased the proportion for potatoes. So you have a higher emphasis on bread versus potatoes.
So you're talking about using the comparison between the opportunity cost of a product. So let's say bread with the price that it's selling at. So those are being compared, and then the plan target is being adjusted based on that comparison. So if the price is higher than the opportunity cost, then this is taken as a signal that it would make sense for more of this to be produced because people are willing to pay more than the calculated cost of producing it, which is the opportunity cost. And similarly, in the reverse case, if the opportunity cost is higher than the price, people aren't actually willing to pay a price which is equal to the opportunity cost. They're willing to pay that. Well, then that's an indication that too much of it is being produced. And so the plan target, which is basically a recipe for the entire economy, we talked about that last time. The example was falafel. If you want to make falafel, then you have 1 tin of chickpeas, portion of garlic and two parsleys. But this is for the whole economy.
Let me just correct you there. So the plan target is not what you might call a recipe. It doesn't tell you what you need to produce falafel. It rather tells you how much falafel should you produce relative to halloumi and kebab and other things, right? So because if you produce too much falafel, right, there might actually not be that many people who want to eat falafel. Maybe more people want to eat halloumi instead. So the plan target sort of tells you sort of the proportions at which various products should be produced. It doesn't tell you that's a different table. The input table would tell you what you need to produce it, right? That would be the recipe. But the plan target tells you how much of various things to produce in proportion to other things.
I'm talking about in the economy. What I was trying to get across, we went through this last time, which is that if you're producing 1 unit of potatoes, then there will also be produced 2 units of iron, 5 units of bicycles, 3 units of electricity. And so, like you said, they're fixed proportions. So that's where I was going wrong with the recipe is that it scales up in fixed proportions. But anyway, the point being that comparing the opportunity cost of the prices, this feeds back then and changes that target, that plan target. So the proportions will change. So if people don't want bread, then the amount of bread in this plan target will decrease. Okay, so now, now what?
Yeah, so now you change the plan target. So you change the proportions at which various consumer products are being produced to basically the idea here is to adjust them to what people actually want and need, right? And then you have a new plan target. And based on that, you can then calculate a new production plan for the next period. So you had some initial plan target that you started off with. So you're now changing that plan target, somewhat adjusting that in response to the behavior of consumers. And now you start with the next period and you do the same thing basically again. So you'll have a slightly different composition of products now. You'll again market them to consumers. Every day you adjust the price until you approach market clearing prices. And then at the end of the period, again, the same for the third period, you would adjust the target and recalculate the plan. So each plan period, you get a slightly different composition and it keeps sort of being adjusted to match what consumers actually are willing to spend their vouchers or credits on.
So the way you've done this is, I mean, you said there that the consumer model runs for 30 iterations, which we could think of as 30 days or a month. And so, you know, consumers going into shops and buying things and, you know, liking the prices or not liking the prices and changing their demand. But if we just think about the real world, I mean, would you envisage this model applying in real life in a similar way, that the plan target might be updated once a month? Or is this just the way the simulation functions?
Yeah, so this is just the way I did it in the simulation. How you're going to do it in the real world depends, for example, on how long it takes to calculate an optimal plan, right? So if it only takes a couple of minutes, then maybe you can update it every day, right? If it takes a couple of days, then maybe once a week or once a month is more realistic. But I needed to choose some number here, and also the other factor was I wanted, for the simulation at least, sufficient time for prices to adjust to market clearing prices before I calculate a new plan. So that's why I chose this sort of 30-day period. In the real world, of course, you could adjust it depending on how fast market clearing prices or how fast prices approach market clearing prices, how long it takes to calculate a new production plan and so on. So you could do this a lot faster if that is feasible from a computational standpoint. Yeah.
Okay, so we've been mostly talking about the model, but what about the simulation and the results of the simulation? What happened there?
Yeah, so what I was particularly interested in is what happens when you introduce a constraint on emissions. So the idea, I tested this in sort of a very simplified setting, because this way it's basically easier. It was easier for me and also for someone else looking at this to understand what is actually going on here. So I took an economy which only has two different consumer products. And the idea is that one of these products takes a lot of emissions. It takes a lot of energy, which takes emissions, right, to produce. And the other product is sort of the more green, environmentally friendly product, has a lower carbon footprint. Right. And I wanted to see, well, if we now introduce a constraint on emissions, how does that affect the proportions at which these products will be produced? Will we produce more of the product that has actually high carbon emissions? Or will we produce less of that, but more of the environmentally friendly product? And I think this would be sort of what makes sense, and what should happen in an ideal model is that as you limit emissions, that increases sort of the cost of producing a product that takes a lot of emissions, because these are now a scarce resource that we have to economize on. And that means we should probably be sort of producing less of that and maybe use it to produce something else instead, which doesn't use up all of these emission rights. So I then tested this and I compared the labor value model of Cockshott and Cottrell with my opportunity cost model, and also looked at sort of how these two differ. And first, what I did is, well, what happens if you don't have an emission constraint at all? So basically, the economy is allowed to produce as many greenhouse gas emissions as is necessary to produce as much as possible. You don't care about emissions at all. And I chose sort of the basic parameters of the simulation such that under these circumstances, the proportions of A and B being produced are 1-to-1. So what happens is you produce one of the environmentally destructive product. So maybe this is meat, which sort of has a higher greenhouse gas emissions than maybe the vegetarian option, which has lower carbon emissions. Right? So you produce 1 unit of meat for every unit of the veggie option, right? And that's when you don't have an emission constraint. That's exactly the same in the labor value model and in my opportunity cost model. When you don't take emissions into account, both models basically had the same result under these circumstances. But if you now introduce an emission constraint and say, well, we can't overall emit more CO2 or more greenhouse gases than a certain cap, then what happens in the labor value model, at least in some cases that I looked into, is that you simply produce less overall. So you don't change the proportions. You don't say we're going to produce less meat because it's so environmentally destructive, but we're going to keep producing as much of the veggie option or even more of the veggie option. No, instead, what you did is you kept the proportions of 1-to-1. You just produce less overall because that's all you can produce without violating the emissions constraint. But there's no change in the proportions, because that's the reason there's no change in the calculated cost of producing these items. Emissions aren't factored into labor values. So meat doesn't get a higher cost of producing just because you now want to limit the amount of emissions, and meat takes a lot of emissions to produce. So that's not factored into the cost, and accordingly, it doesn't factor into sort of the mix of products being produced. But what happens in my opportunity cost value model is that meat actually, when you introduce an emission constraint, gets a lot higher opportunity cost, because all those emission rights being used to produce meat could be used to produce a lot of other things. And that increases the cost of meat. And this then results in there being a lot less meat being produced because it has a higher cost and not as many people are willing to pay that high of a price, such that the cost and the price is somehow balanced. So you see actually not just a reduction in the overall production to meet the emission constraint, but you see a shift. You see a drastic reduction of meat production, but a relative increase of the production of the veggie option, the environmentally friendly option.
Yeah, it's very interesting. And I'm going to include pictures from the paper throughout this. So just visually, this is represented as, you can think about this plan target as being a vector.
So the plan target gives you sort of the direction of a vector, right? So you can imagine the plan target specifies, so you have a product space, right? And then because you just have 2 products, it's 2-dimensional. That's why I chose 2 products. It's easier to understand, right? And the target tells you, well, in which direction is that arrow going to be? Because it tells you the proportions at which products are being produced. And then the length of the vector tells you, well, how much are we producing at these proportions? And without emissions, basically you get a 1-to-1 proportion. So the vector is sort of at a 45-degree angle, and the length is sort of as long as is possible with available resources, not taking into account the emissions. You can produce as many emissions as you want, or as is necessary to produce as much as is possible. And so in the labor value model, when you then introduce an emission constraint, what happens is the direction of the arrow remains the same. You simply decrease the length of the arrow. So you maintain the same proportions, but produce less overall. While in my model, you actually change the direction of the vector towards sort of the environmentally friendly product. So you actually see a shift in the kinds of things being produced and not just the quantity of what is being produced.
Yes, exactly. So what other kind of results did you get?
Yeah, I mean, this was the main thing that I was interested in. I also ran some tests to see sort of what the computational complexity. So I used linear programming, and sort of my results were consistent with other tests of that Paul Cockshott did on sort of the complexity of linear programming for these kinds of planning problems. Yes, but the main thing that I was interested in was precisely this: how other factors than labor, in particular emission rights, affect the costs of producing items compared to labor values, and how that then affects the composition of products being produced, right? And the results were, for the most part, sort of consistent with my expectation, and I think demonstrate that opportunity costs are sort of a more adequate measure of cost and and that it really matters which one we choose because it will lead to a different mix of products being produced.
Yeah, the simulation is very interesting. It's, of course, it's basically a proof of concept because there's a toy economy. But I think, yes, it does show that, like you were describing, there is that qualitative difference between the labor value model and the opportunity cost value model, where one is just you have the same plan target, the same kind of mix for the economy, and you're just scaling up and down. In the opportunity cost model, it's more dynamic in the sense that that mix can actually change. Okay, so we've talked about the model, we've talked about the simulations. So what work remains to be done, do you think?
So there are a lot of simplifications in my simulation. And what could be done is sort of have a sort of more refined version of it, which takes into account a lot of things which I haven't taken into account. So, for example, one major limitation of my simulation is that it doesn't really consider economic growth and sort of change in the capital stock, right? So you don't have a scenario where, for example, what you can produce in the second year depends on the machinery that you produced in the first year. So that's currently not taken into account in my simulation. There's literature on this. So Paul Cockshott has written about sort of multi-year plans where you get precisely this, right? What you produce in the second year depends on the machinery that's available, which can be also sort of produced in the prior year and built up and so on. But there is, as far as I know, no model yet which tries to combine these multi-year plans with consumer feedback. So you have this sort of short-term planning, where you don't really see a change in the composition of capital goods, which is in response to consumer goods. That's what I did. You have these multi-year plans where you do see a change in the composition of capital goods, and you can build up capital stock and so on. But that wasn't made responsive to consumer demand. So I think what should be done next is to have sort of a model which does both, right? Where you have constant change in capital stock, but the production specifically of consumer products is also made responsive to consumer demand, and the proportions at which various products are being produced continually get sort of adjusted depending on consumer demand.
And is that something that you think you'll find yourself working on?
So at the moment, I'm not working on that yet. Maybe that's something I'll get the time to get to at some point. At the moment, I'm working on some questions which are more related to philosophy. So I'm working on Marx's concept of alienation and looking how that applies to socialist society. So Marx criticized capitalism because he thought that labor was alienated under capitalism. And then the question I asked myself is, well, isn't labor still alienated under socialism? What's different under socialism that suddenly people are not alienated but are free in some sense, right? So that's what I'm currently working on. And the other thing I'm working on is I'm sort of in active exchange with economists from the Austrian School of Economics who've sort of long criticized the feasibility of socialist planning. And we are sort of discussing whether these sort of cyber-socialist, or sometimes they call them techno-socialist models, whether they are an adequate response to this socialist calculation problem, which they think is sort of a fundamental problem of socialism. So I'm engaged in sort of active exchanges with them. There's a special issue that's going to come out, I think, sometime later this year or maybe next year. Be sort of an exchange along those lines. And then I'm also working on another paper with political scientist Dan Greenwood, where we really try to sort of see where this debate is currently at. So which problems of socialism is the cyber-socialist models, such as the ones we discussed, able to overcome, and which problems maybe still remain.
For the people watching, in terms of you're saying that there's work remaining to be done on integrating an opportunity cost model of central planning with consumer feedback with a multi-year investment planning model. And so if there's somebody watching who thinks that they're up to the task, something to consider. We'll leave it there. So thank you very much for joining me again, Philip Dapprich, talking about introducing opportunity cost valuations and multiple production techniques into central planning, because these are two of the most fundamental issues, most fundamental criticisms that can be made of central planning as a model. And so it's very interesting to see the work that you've been doing It's very interesting and important. On a general note, so in terms of this channel, I focus largely on post-capitalist futures. And so I think there are essentially three main categories, I think, of post-capitalist futures. The first is some variety of market socialism. The other is central planning, and then there's economic planning, but it's in another way. So participatory economics is the best example. And what I'm interested in is in each of these models being developed to its greatest extent. I think we all benefit from that. I'm not interested in just picking a horse and following that. I certainly have opinions on what I think is good and bad about each of these. I think that the work you're doing is very important, is what I'm trying to say.
Yeah, thank you very much. No, and I agree that it's important, to consider sort of different models. And obviously I have a horse in this race, but I'm also always interested in engaging with alternative approaches. And I think there's, for example, a serious debate to be had about sort of the role of markets that they can and maybe should play and under socialism. Obviously, under certain circumstances, they, can yield sort of efficient outcomes. I think what I'm trying to show is that we do use something like markets for consumer products, something vaguely resembling markets anyways, right? What I'm trying to show is that, actually, maybe you don't need markets to determine sort of an optimal plan. Maybe you can actually do it in another way as well. But even if that's right, that doesn't necessarily mean that it's the best way. So I think, we need to look into other models as well, and need to have these discussions. And it's good that people are working on other proposals.
Okay, but it's been great to talk about your proposal. And so thank you very much for joining me.
Yeah, thank you so much. It was a very, very pleasant discussion.
Thank you for watching. If you got anything from this video, then please press the like button, consider subscribing, and if you really enjoyed it, then repeat every word at the top of your lungs like they did in Occupy Wall Street. There's a lot more to come. We'll keep exploring better futures for humanity until we get there. And as always, I want to hear your thoughts in the comment section below. This channel has a wonderful audience, and there are usually some very interesting comments under the video, so let's continue that. That's all for now. Our democratic future lies after the oligarchy.